Hello, everyone, and welcome to another of Cohere's podcasts from a series, Are We All Listening? I'm very grateful today to be joined by Julia Frei from Same Skies. Cohere has collaborated and partnered with Same Skies for at least 6 years now, and there are definitely a lot of similarities and overlaps in the work that we've been doing with refugee leaders just in different parts of the world, as Same Skies is in the Far East, whereas Cohere's in Africa. But I won't say any more about Same Skies. I'll hand over to you, Julia. Thanks for joining. And maybe you could start by giving us the broad story of Same Skies and how you got into this work.
Sure, pleasure. Thank you for having me here on this podcast. Always enjoy chatting to you, so this is great. Maybe I start with myself. Like I'm from Switzerland originally. I grew up and was born and raised here in Switzerland in a pretty privileged context, I would say. I studied anthropology, which reflects a bit on my interest in people from different cultures, different backgrounds that I always had. And after I finished my studies here in Switzerland, I left Switzerland pretty much straight away. I always thought I would leave as soon as I could, but I always thought I would find myself more in a developing context, let's say Global South, and I ended up in Australia by coincidence for personal reasons. And it was there that I got into the work with displaced people, with refugees. I worked with the Red Cross for a number of years, which gave me a very nice way to work with people still from very different backgrounds all over the world, because I felt a little bit Australia, even though very different to Switzerland, still had quite a lot of similarities, still was very Western in some ways. And so I really got into it working in Australia, and also my experience, I think, is heavily impacted by the Australian policies of that time. So in 2012, when the Australian government reopened those infamous offshore processing centers in Nauru and Manus in Papua New Guinea, I took a job to go and work there after leaving the Red Cross. I don't know how much listeners know about this, but considering that most people work in this field, I guess, those offshore processing centers might be familiar. The work there was very, very limited and very frustrating for us, like who came from a more like social work or educational background, because there were so many restrictive policies. And so basically we worked in a man-made camp, or almost like a detention center, but very basic one. And people were very, very bored, very disillusioned. And almost the same thing happened to us humanitarian workers there, because often we were just sent into this camp setting and told to entertain people, socialize. And, considering that some of the people there had been incarcerated and institutionalized for what became years for some of them, we just saw so much potential and being wasted away. And I think this was the main thing that the co-founders of Same Skies, so that's Brad, Laura, and I, who all met while we were working there in Nauru, that we had in common, like that we debriefed a lot on that potential and all those resources and Nauru was a very clear example of that, but I think that's the same in many contexts in the world, that we don't acknowledge and utilize also the potential that refugees bring to the host communities. And that's how Same Skies started, basically. That was the ideology, the thought that we all shared, like that we felt we wanted to find different ways, better ways of partnering with refugee communities. And then my colleague Laura, a good friend, she went to Indonesia and also met families that had been stranded there, some for just months, some for years already, through these Australian policies, and had zero access to education or any kind of basic human rights. And it all started because these families that Laura met kind of asked her if she would help them raise a bit of money and support them with a bit of setup funding, some resources to start educating their own children. At that time, the term RLO did not exist, at least not in Southeast Asia where we work. And Laura asked me if I would help her just to get some resources for this community, for these families. And I said yes, but if we do that, I want to to take it further. I want to be able to do more. And so I went back to studying, and in the process of that, we founded Same Skies. And yeah, so from the beginning, our aim, our main objective was to partner with refugee communities and groups at eye level. And yeah, the rest is history. You know the rest.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because actually I don't think I've heard the founding story of Same Skies in so much detail. And it's really interesting, the parallels with Cohere, or Zebra Project as it was, when Zebra Project began in 2008. That phrase around supporting families to be able to pay for their own children's education was actually the exact same story for Cohere in the beginning.
I never knew that either.
Yeah, it's interesting to fall into it in a similar way. And maybe it was similar for us, that it wasn't intended to necessarily be an organization per se. In fact, it was called Zebra Project. One of the reasons was that it wasn't really meant to be a long-term thing or an organization, and necessarily, but seeing it more as a project. It was something that I myself wasn't working on full-time. I didn't know how long it would last. So in your case, for Same Skies, when did you realize that it was becoming an organization? Did you have an idea of starting something that would look like a NGO or a charity when you were studying, and how did that come about?
No, I think in the same way as you, like it kind of just developed organically over time. So when we started it, we were all still working in Nauru, so we had fly in, fly out jobs, which meant that, we would be on island for 3 weeks and work quite intensively, and then have 3 weeks off. So then we would have time to work on other things, on the Same Skies idea and all that. And I think and then we started to support this first group of refugees, or actually that group we facilitated from the onset. It started with a community session, and at the end of the 2-day workshop, we asked for volunteers who wanted to start something with us. And I think as we were growing, or as the RLO started to develop and grow and build further, we grew alongside them. And I think what was quite interesting for me always, and still is that, we went through the exact same challenges, the exact same needs on an organizational level. And I think that's also why it worked quite well, because everything we did developed organically alongside the RLO, and we could also relate very well to the challenges they had. We understood really well what they needed to build, to gain more sustainability, to put more structure in place, what type of structure was needed, what wasn't. So it's a really interesting process with Refugee Learning Nest, which is the first RLO that came out of that, and us, because yes, the needs were very similar, and it all grew in a very organic kind of way. So I don't know if there was a certain point. I guess there was a certain point where, we needed registration, we needed more of a legal framework and all that. So I would say that came pretty quickly. And I guess from that point on, it was clear that it would be an organization or a legal entity of some sorts. But, whatever that means is not, I don't think there was a specific date that I recall, or a specific moment where I knew, like, okay, now this is an NGO now. I'm still not sure that's what it is. Like, I still often think, like, are we a network? Are we, what are we exactly? Are we just a group of people who have the same objective? I don't know.
Yeah. So I can have a lot of follow-up questions on what you're just saying there about the organization and how it functions as a group of people. But maybe just before going into some of those, maybe you could tell me a bit more about Refugee Learning Nest and your partnership with them, because you were saying that for some time at least, you had a relationship between Same Skies and Refugee Learning Nest, and they were the only refugee-led organization you were partnering with. Is that right?
So in 2014, my colleague Laura, she went to Indonesia and she met these families that had asked her if we could help them, or if she could help them, I should say, resource their group to educate children. And so she came back and she proposed that to me, and we took a bit of time to consider that idea and to think about what would be the best way forward, what would be the best strategy with that. So it took us a couple of months, I would say, to go back to Indonesia and to that location. And in the meantime, a very informal RLO had formed, basically doing exactly what that group had requested us to support them with. And so in the initial days, we were consulting other stakeholders on the ground and asking for guidance, because we really didn't know the Indonesian context that well. And so that group obviously was one of the first groups that we got in touch with. And so we were considering for a while whether it would make sense to support that group rather than starting something new, of course. But the group itself, or the members of that group, actually were the ones who told us, no, we are already quite established, even though very young, but we have some supporters, and what we also have is a huge waiting list already, even though we've only been operational for a month or two. Like, our center is already full, and we already have a waiting list of people who are interested. So what would help us a lot more is if you could replicate what we are doing with some other people, and we would be your mentors, basically. And we said, okay, that's an interesting idea, and also very much aligned, of course, with our whole approach of seeing them as resources, so that we had kind of mentors and cultural advisors from within the refugee community from the onset, I think was very significant. And so what we did together with this group of people who had started the RLO was to organize this community consultation session, we called it, but I'm not sure that's a good term for it. And we just invited anyone from the community who was interested, and we workshopped for 2 days what they see as the most significant challenges, but also mostly focusing on what resources they have within their community. And so, yeah, very, very soon it became apparent that education would be the focus. And at the end of the 2 days, we asked for volunteers. We had, at that time, mostly male volunteers. We had 1 female. And so we had a group of roughly maybe 10 people. And we started to work with them mostly remotely, because from the onset, we also said that we don't want to be based on the ground. We don't want to follow that traditional or conventional approach of an NGO to be there, because we said, okay, we want to see what happens. Like, let's assume it's not just that communities become dependent on NGOs, but that we actually also make them dependent on us by being present there. And so from the onset, we said, okay, we want to test what happens if we are not there. We are not in close proximity to where they are based. And so from the beginning, we spelled it out pretty transparently, what they could expect, what not, what we would expect them to do themselves, and we developed those ideas together further. And so in the early days, yes, we only worked with that 1 group, and we would go and visit them very regularly, sometimes every month, every 2 months, and do trainings based on whatever they requested, workshops on team building, group development, leadership, a lot of teacher training, of course, in the early days as well, and working on setting up the structures that they wanted to develop. But then in between, we always followed up through modern technology. Like, that was even before the pandemic. We used Zoom a lot and all those tools that are at our disposal, of course, which helped a lot. And then about a year later, we were approached by similar people again, because that first group that we had, that those people who had been our mentors throughout the process, had kind of gotten into a little bit of a conflict within the group, and they had split. And so there were suddenly 3 RLOs, and then so the one split off group approached us again and asked if we would support them in the same way as we had supported Refugee Learning Nest. And that's how it kind of, and then over time also, as you can imagine, I guess it's similar in Africa, the idea was replicated quite a lot organically, just by some of them we would be partnering with, some other groups not. But yeah, suddenly RLOs popped out of the ground like mushrooms all over the place. Some successful, some not so much, but yeah, it was also a lot of learning in that, I think.
No, it's really interesting how early you saw an organization's main work to be all about partnering with or allying with refugee leaders. I remember, conversely, when I was first living full time in East Africa in 2012, when Cohere, as it's now called, was still focused on education and I went to visit someone from an organization called Refugee Law Project who had been working with refugees in Uganda for around 10 years. And I was telling him about this new project. We'd been going for 4 years, but it was new to be full time. And his response to me was basically, the best thing you could probably do would be to partner with refugee-led organizations to help them achieve what they want to do, rather than come and turn up and think you've got good ideas around education. There's plenty of refugee-led organizations emerging in Kampala who, if they had support in accessing the rest of the sector, could do a lot more. And I didn't really understand what he was saying. We'd already spent quite a bit of time working with other refugee-led organizations in all these networks. I was really good friends with refugee leaders. We used to meet at least once a month and talk through our shared challenges and opportunities, and sometimes things like funding would come up, but we didn't know anything about how to raise funds either. I saw them as mentors to me in a similar way that you do, and I was trying to tell this person giving me this advice that we already had our projects, we had our network of parents who wanted us to carry on fundraising, and we already knew what we were doing, apparently. So I actually told him, I think about 8 years later, that it had taken me, or our team, 6 or 7 years to come round to what he was saying, that it was spot on, and I should have listened more at the time. But it also interesting because Kampala was, I think, probably one of the emerging capitals of refugee-led organizations, and there were already in the early 2000s a number of quite significant refugee-led organizations, which in other parts of the world wasn't so possible. And so I think you sort of came in straight into the work that you could feel was appropriate, whereas I think for me, and probably similar for many humanitarian focused organizations that have been going for some time, it had to be an adjustment to realize that actually we don't have the ideas, we don't know what was best, even if everything sounds great, like help children go to school. We can't turn up in a country like Uganda and understand the needs of refugees at face value. It's just impossible and maybe, do you think your background in anthropology had probably got you further ahead in understanding the limitations of different paradigms and the way people assume, or and Westerners think that they understand what's good and what's bad, and that every community would probably want to experience their version of good, and how do you think that had an impact on how your organization evolved in the early years?
Absolutely. I think while you were speaking, I just thought of two things that I was going to mention that maybe helped me get to this conclusion or this ideology, let's say, a bit quicker. And the first one I wanted to mention was my studies, for sure. Like, I think, I spent 6 years at university, and the only thing that I actually took away from it, I think, is that we just don't know anything, and that who are we to even define or assume that we know what other people need. And we talked a lot at university about egocentric and Eurocentric approaches, and even, I studied 20 years ago, and even at that time, I had a lot of professors who were so upset and frustrated that we've been talking about this for decades, and now it's 2 decades later again. We still tell other people what's best for them, and we still don't really all listen, right? So for sure, that was the first factor. But the second one, I think, also is that the context was quite different. And as you say, like, Uganda is a positive example of how refugees can be integrated and all that. I'm sure it's not all that shiny, but at least in comparison to Indonesia, they have certain access to social and just life, human rights that they need. And Indonesia was very different, especially 12 years ago when we started. Refugees, because those countries have not signed the Refugee Convention, and so they're kind of, there's no law that applies to refugees. They're just undocumented illegal immigrants, legally. And so they really don't have access to education, to healthcare, to livelihoods. And also at the time, those countries were considered transit countries. So when we came in, our aim was not to build something long term. Like we didn't have the intention to set something up that would create any parallel structures or be sustainable in that sense. Like we didn't expect that people would be there for a decade. At the time, people were hoping to be resettled through UNHCR within months, maybe years, but not the same context as what we know now. And so from our side, from Same Sky's perspective, even though the RLO's priority at that time, the community's priority was clearly education, from our side, the objective was not to deliver or facilitate the highest level, highest quality of education we could. Our objective was to give those people who are in charge, who are leading and driving and managing those initiatives, those projects that we help to facilitate, to give them some sort of purpose, meaning, agency back that they had lost throughout the process of displacement. And by being in this context that had marginalized them to a very, very high level, like many of them at the time really were not leaving their house. They were, and we are not talking camp settings either. So I think this is also a significant difference, that we work with urban refugees who had dispersed in the community. And so when we came in, there was no community to speak of. People were just individuals in their homes and very, very scared to even leave the house or get involved in anything. And so I think the setting is also a significant difference, even though there were, of course, a lot of parallels. But yeah, and until this day, I often think that our regional focus is contributing quite a bit to why we also maybe not have opposing views or different views, but different frameworks that we operate within.
Definitely. I think with that point about agency is fascinating. In Switzerland, they maybe have the highest level of political agency in the world, in the sense that you vote on every issue, don't you? You have compulsory voting. And in most countries in the global north, we all grew up understanding that our relationship between ourselves and the authorities were reciprocal, in the sense that we had some influence or some control, or at least as when we were children, at least our parents could vote. And ever since we were very young, we're seeing the people being able to own all the institutions and all the policies that affect them collectively. And so when we look at all the images of refugees or Africa, and the first thing that comes to your mind is those people that are poor, they must need food, they must need education, they must need protection. It doesn't even cross our mind to question whether they're, in many cases, entire lack of lack of any political agency, like you've described, not even having any form of legal status in that country, just being a stateless person effectively, what that would be like. It doesn't come into the framing of a humanitarian response or a humanitarian context to dive into that bit, because it's much harder to capture in pictures, it's much harder to explain, it's probably harder to raise money for. And in the early years when we'd converted, let's say around 2016, 2017, we'd converted to just working with refugee-led organizations. Even people working in the sector couldn't understand that we would want to change our mindset away from handouts and how people could get short-term benefits to thinking about high-level human needs that the sector's neglected, like agency or justice or self-sovereignty. And for us, that was in the form of partnering with refugee-led organizations. But I think, like you say, even till now, the entire sector is preoccupied with the former parts of just handouts. And the larger institutions will even admit we're a protection agency. This is our first and foremost. We're here to protect, and that can spill over into other subsectors like education and livelihoods as well. But let's not pretend that we're anything other than a protection agency, which I've always felt just puts a limitation on really what it's all about and what a bigger objective or bigger goal could be. Is this something that also you've experienced working in Indonesia and Malaysia?
I'm not sure if I'm exactly responding to your question with this, but
one
thing that I think is very significant and hardly ever spoken about is why we get into this work in the first place. And I think one thing that we often deny, or no one really likes to admit, is that being a humanitarian worker, whatever that image that comes to mind, is not a purely, or shouldn't be a purely altruistic objective. And I think when you admit that it is not purely altruistic, and you're not the hero helping someone, or but that you are in it also because it's meaningful to you, maybe it gives your life purpose, maybe it is interesting, maybe you learn a lot, maybe whatever that may be. I think if we were more honest about why we are in this and what the different reasons are, and if we put more effort into actively deconstructing those biases we have, because we all have them, and I don't think there's anything wrong with having them. Of course, we do not like to admit them, and especially if we are in this field and we should be so educated around the whole topic of, but deconstructing racism and decolonializing systems and all that. I mean, this is an extremely complex and difficult process. And I think if we were more honest about that, and also about the reasons, why we are in this, that our intrinsic motivation is not only altruistic, then it also would show more or highlight that there is something to gain for you. And I think this is how I probably got there through my studies, as you said. But I do think this was very significant for me in terms of how I see things, and how I try to align values within Same Skies as well, with the people that, with the RLOs, but also with people that are on our team. I think this is the most important thing, because if we do not yet, truly see the RLOs and the people that the RLOs are assisting as having the potential to be completely equal partners to us, then we can stop doing what we're doing. And I think this is a quite lengthy and also difficult internal process on an individual level, but also on an organizational level. And that's what I've seen as the biggest or most significant barrier in, successfully implementing this equitable partnerships kind of approaches. For me, it's what's needed is not more policies and frameworks and SOPs on how we do that, but it's an internal process. It's a strong belief in that first. That should be the starting point. And I don't think that starting point is even given in many cases.
No, I totally agree. I think the mixed motives within what people think of as charity or non-profit or development humanitarian work, when you really unpick them, you see how much it can pollute the whole concept of humanitarianism to the point where it actually becomes a contradiction. I think, and actually it's really difficult, like you say, to extract yourself from those questions. For example, if you look at philanthropy, the two things that come through a lot when people talk about philanthropy is impact and scale. And in both cases, the drive towards impact and scale are quite clearly self-serving. And it's very few philanthropists who are obsessed with scale or impact, but also want to give anonymously. There are some, but most of them would want everyone to know that what they're doing to achieve that impact, effectively to take credit. And in some cases, it's explicit. So, I've made all this money and I want to do some good in the world. And that what that's basically saying is, I'm going to be the one doing this good because I'm going to be giving away all these millions or billions. And as soon as you want to be able to take credit for that impact, you've then got to prove that that impact's happened. So one person has got to be able to demonstrate that they've reached 1 million people through their, they've created 1 million jobs, and that no one can really doubt that. They need to be able to prove it through some kind of evidence, and that evidence will be in the form of everything from the due diligence down to the reporting of all the different actors that philanthropist has utilized to achieve this goal that he or she wants to take credit for. So that we could talk about how that will end up becoming exclusionary. We've already talked, like you said, about how agency is a much more overall in the in a context like that. Agency is much more important than the impact itself, because you're disempowering those 1 million people by claiming that the change in their life are down to your generosity. But then similarly with scale, if you want to keep on copying and pasting what you're doing, you're again taking credit for it, but you also have to have the control over it. And it's all these ideas are still so dominant within our sector that when you're running an organization, it's very difficult to weave your way between it without getting distracted or drawn into it a little bit. And I know from our conversations that we've both found challenges with that. One of the challenges is obviously with fundraising, full stop, because most donors want to hear this language. What's the impact going to be? How are you going to scale this? How can my contribution sort of be relevant so that I can be satisfied with what I've done?
Absolutely. And I think that's why we are only half successful in fundraising and growing, because I absolutely don't believe in measuring impact in numbers, because what we do is, as you and I have talked about many times, so relational, and building this kind of trust and rapport that you need with people can just not be sped up more than it can be, and I do think also that, as I said, like, aligning values also takes time. So even as an organization, I'm not entirely sure that our biggest goal should be to scale our organizations to the point where we can no longer guarantee that the values of our team members are aligned. I don't think that would, sure, maybe then we can produce numbers to say, like, okay, now we have impacted on this and that many lives, but have we really helped anyone make a significant change in their lives? And I think this is, for me, one of the number one priorities in whatever we do, whatever support we offer, is always to support and also strengthen sustainable structures. And that's not just financially sustainable, but also culturally sustainable for the size of that RLO. I don't always advise them to just take any steps they can to grow, because sometimes it's not the right time, and sometimes you're not ready to grow, and sometimes you have grown and have to admit that that wasn't the right time, and you have to even take a step back. And I think that is, yes, it means it's very difficult for us to find the right partners in terms of donors and others that we collaborate with who understand that, but also it means that for ourselves and within our own organizations, if we truly want to nurture agency and ownership and independence, then we have to often learn to be patient and to accept that things don't always go the way we want them to and don't always function at the speed that we would like them to. But that's necessary. It's absolutely crucial for sustainable growth, because, again, we are not defining what growth means to them, what means having structures that they will be able to support long term. And so I think, again, most of it comes back to an internal learning process where we have to admit, okay, we're again kind of putting some sort of expectations and structures on them that are not internal. They don't come from those communities, and maybe we are the ones that have to adjust to that. And for sure, sometimes we can find a middle ground and find ourselves somewhere. But overall, for me, the conclusion usually is that we have to adjust our expectations and our influence on them as well. Sometimes, for me, I think the most difficult parts of these last 12 years of leading and growing Same Skies have been the moments where we had to admit that we think this is now not the right decision, but let's take a step back and let them take this decision anyway. Because to me, it's a little bit like being a parent, or maybe even just better, like a big sister, or someone who might think she knows better sometimes, but doesn't always have to voice that, and then be committed to still being there and helping them pick up the pieces if it didn't go right. And that's not even to say, see, I told you so, but it's just like, that is for me true commitment and partnership, that you say, okay, I'll let you do that, and my door will be open. I'll be here if it doesn't go right. If it does, I'll cheer you on and I'll be so happy. But yeah, I think usually it comes down to some sort of internal learning that we have to do.
Yeah, and many years later, you can reflect back and realize that what you would have advocated for may have not been the most appropriate approach anyway.
Yep.
You talked about trust-based relationships quite a bit, and how do you think the flow of funds within those relationships affects the trust in those relationships? I'm asking because I believe you also talked about relationships and processes and systems and so on. And when we think about agency and higher level human needs, my belief is that agency is only possible for everyone to be involved in, so inclusive to everyone, through a relationship-based approach. Any systems-based approach to basically taking the human element out of a relationship will end up being exclusionary and will jeopardize the agency, particularly of the most marginalized. And so if we have to center everything on relationships and increasingly just thinking about, like you say, internal learning, just constantly learning about how those relationships can be more appropriate, I think for me, one of the biggest questions and challenges that come up is how money affects those relationships, how money can threaten the trust and the equitableness of a relationship. What are some of your experiences in that regard?
Yes, I do think that's a risk, and it can affect the relationship you have with groups. I think in our case, we work with a small number of RLOs. So currently we have 9 groups that we are working with, and we try to build long-term relationship with those groups. So for example, Refugee Learning Nest, we have been supporting for the last 12 years, sometimes more intensively, sometimes less, really very much based on their needs, on their requests. But we do very intentionally not position ourselves as a donor or not even as an intermediary. And we do always spell that out over and over. Also, when we start partnership with new groups, we often explicitly tell them that there will be no funding passed to them. And we only engage if our values align, if the other support offers that we have are a good match, and if they feel like they see some value in that. If not, of course, they are free to choose not to partner with us. And secondly, so we always made it a rule that even if we had small funding that we would pass on to our RLO partners, we basically just split the funds. So we don't make decisions on who receives what. We basically tell them, this is the funding we have at our disposal that we can distribute between all of our partners. And now you tell us how you want to use those funds. And basically, we just check that, we feel there is some sustainability in that. So again, normally we prefer to fund setup costs rather than ongoing costs, because we don't want to make RLOs dependent on us. And so typically we would approve setup costs, which could be anything though. Like it doesn't just have to be, it doesn't have to be infrastructure or resources necessarily. It could also be investing in some sort of human resources or something that they see as would help them grow their capacity in the long run. And I do think we are very transparent also about the fact that we have very little funding to distribute. So I think it's almost like they know there isn't much to gain from us in terms of funding. And so those little grants that we were able to pass on sometimes didn't really stand in the way, I think. But we did have issues where other donors came into the landscape and provided funding, larger scale funding, and that very much changed what RLOs were looking for. And that has cost us at least one relationship with an RLO that we had been working with for a long time, which is understandable, but also a pity for us, of course, because it has kind of corrupted that long-term relationship we had. But fair enough, like if they prioritize that more, then that's their choice.
And you mentioned when you recruit new partners, often there's no money changing hands for some time. How do you feel, that you're clearly able to build a trust-based relationship when there's no money changing hands? And sometimes I think about what's going on in a trust-based relationship as, there is a sense of value. There are forms of currency that take place, and it's quite hard to have a trust-based relationship in a relationship where it's very, very unbalanced as to how you're giving of yourselves. You can imagine, where as soon as a relationship it doesn't have that mutual element. I don't want to make it too much transactional, but it still doesn't last long if people feel there's an imbalance. So I guess they start feeling a sense of injustice. But it seems that in Same Skies situation, you can sustain a trust-based relationship when there's at least no money changing hands. So what other elements of value you think for both parties that can help you sustain that over a long period of time, even when there's no money involved?
It's actually funny that you mentioned that, because lately I feel that especially when we're talking about access to funding, for example, in the Southeast Asian context, there have been increasing opportunities for RLOs and less opportunities for allies like Same Skies, for example. And so in the last couple of years, something very interesting has happened for us, and that's whereby RLOs would approach us to request fiscal sponsorship, for example. So they already found an opportunity. They had already maybe even secured a grant, but then in the due diligence procedure, they realized, okay, we cannot now actually, or maybe the donor realized at that point, we cannot actually pay out those funds because they don't fulfill our internal requirements. And so because it would maybe take them too long or be too challenging to change their own structures and requirements, they were looking for a fiscal sponsor. And the interesting thing that happened after we do support RLOs with fiscal sponsorships, this is often how we then build a connection to the donor as well, and might be able to access some funding from them as well. And so in that sense, in several cases now, the RLO partners have actually helped us access funding, which is such a beautiful example for me in how those relationships can actually become truly mutually beneficial, And that's just one example. Of course, there is much better examples that don't concern funding, but this is a really tangible one that maybe we didn't expect. We didn't think that for that this type of support from the RLO to us could be possible. And it has happened several times now. So I don't know if, maybe it depends on the context again, but I don't know if the power imbalance has to be there. I think it's a natural feeling we have, but when you have RLOs that become quite good at fundraising and networking as well, we have some members of our partner RLOs that they are in every They are in every community, every training, they soak up every opportunity they can, and therefore they're really well connected. So they often introduce us to interesting partners as well. And I do think if you're more, or if you try to be realistic about who brings what to the table, and that doesn't always have to be, I will always bring this and then we bring that, but just listen to what they also the complexity and the individual capacities and resources that each RLO brings. And I think that has happened for us a lot through the peer-to-peer support network as well, because that's where you find out more about, okay, which RLO, brings this, which RLO is better at that, and then how do we really all just partner together and each stakeholder brings whatever they have to offer.
Yeah, I've experienced similar. Well, I mean, when you talk about what do different stakeholders bring to the table, what can they offer? Like, I think one of the things that makes me nervous sometimes with our role as an ally organization, registered in countries in the global north, that can sometimes be a key ingredient when you talk about being a fiscal sponsor. In the case of some of the places where we're working at the moment, Congo is the one that jumps to mind for me personally in the work that I'm doing, but Cohere we also have partners in South Sudan and Sudan, and which are both in wars now, obviously. But our partners there are asking us to raise funds because for them, agency at the moment is also the same thing as life-saving interventions, and what they're looking for from us is emergency life-saving cash. There's a new Ebola outbreak in the east of Congo just in the last few days. We've had our WhatsApp groups very full of requests for urgent funds for protective equipment, I think, and for other interventions around the Ebola outbreak in a location where there is no medical infrastructure whatsoever at the moment. And the way I see it is that agency for people in that type of a situation is the same thing as life-saving intervention. It's similar for the same people in the last few months have had been reaching out to us because people in their community are in clinics with no medical supplies after extreme gender-based violence or in the result of war, and when thinking, well, we should be funding agency and not handouts or short-term responses, you eventually start thinking, well, those are the same thing in this context. But at the same time, what makes me confused is that they only know one Cohere, who's registered in the UK, registered in the US and Kenya and Uganda, who can use that positioning to apply for funds. And we've actually been successful at doing this, raising funds with UK-based trusts and foundations for rape victims in Eastern Congo. We've been able to channel the funds to 4 different organizations there. 1 or 2 foundations got back to me saying, actually, we don't fund conflict zones because it's too temperamental or too fragile, and we don't know what's going to happen with our money. So they won't even fund a UK organization to fund a conflict zone. But all the same, the local organizations only know us, and then that immediately puts a power imbalance because we're think about supply and demand, as it were. We're in the position where we can pick or choose whether we take those organizations on in those emergency contexts, but they can't really do the same with us. So it creates this bottleneck, and it's sort of the same potentially across Africa as a whole. In all the 10 organizations we're working in, there's not enough Coheres. There's a few more emerging, which is good, but for anyone who's there are still a lot of donors out there who want to fund maybe an organization registered in the global north, or want to register an organization with 18 years experience working in 10 countries like Cohere, and they're not interested in building a direct relationship with the organizations themselves. So it's a dilemma to me, because we have funding from donors like that. Luckily, I know you talk about non-negotiables. We've pushed back a lot, and we've had to reject some funding which just was counterproductive to the concept of funding agency. All of our donors are supporting through unrestricted funding, so they're able to, in a way, tap into a web of relationships where we're not the ones making the decisions as to how the funding is used, and nor is the donor. So that's at least a compromise that seems to work. But I still fear how that financial relationship affects our relationship with communities, because it's just so tempting always for that power to surface, where we realize, okay, well, we've got this massive lump of money. We are now going to be the ones to decide who it goes to. And so in that sense, we've got more agency than you. And that, how is that going to affect the trust that we have with communities? And it's tempting us in Kenya and Uganda to, in the next few years, just move away from any financial flow, even as a fiscal sponsor. But I still get confused as to what it looks like in emergency context, where there's no other options.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting thoughts, Ed. And I have two things to say about that. One is, I don't think, an emergency situation like that is always, that's what it is. It's an emergency situation. It's a scenario that is very different to, hopefully, your normal reality. And I don't think cash assistance or funding things like, emergency food, emergency healthcare in such a situation is actually contradicting what you do. Because if you look at it from a rights-based approach, you're trying to help them claim access to whatever rights, whatever structures, whatever that might be, like society, life. And if those basic needs stand in the way of doing that, then I think that doesn't contradict funding that for the time being. It doesn't mean you're going to do that forever, and it doesn't mean that that's the intention, and you can communicate that very clearly, that this is an emergency case, and you can reassess that after some time and see if it's still needed. But to me, that's not contradicting what you do, because yes, in the end, it is still, survival is the basic to agency. Like if you don't survive, obviously you have zero agency. So that's not contradicting, in my opinion. And then the second thing you talked about, which is very interesting, when you said, okay, but there is no other coheres, like they don't have 10 other organizations that do the same as we do, and they can just pick and choose which one they want to partner with. And that's a really good point. And it, I think it just highlights that you and I and anyone else that is like-minded like that have to start putting a lot more effort into scaling by replication, and not just working with RLOs, but also working with other stakeholders, training other stakeholders, role modeling what we do, and maybe helping other organizations remove barriers, align their values, align their approaches with this, so that we do get to the point where we're like consultancies and RLOs can just pick and choose, and whoever offers them what they need gets the job. Because this is ultimately what I would like to see. Like, ultimately, I would really like it if RLOs had enough money to then engage us for whatever they want to engage us. Like whether that is a specific training, or that is coaching for leadership, or whatever it is. Like, ultimately, if the tables completely turned and they had enough funding to then pay us for whatever service we provide to them, then that would be my happiest day, because then also we would be out of a job when we are no longer needed. We are not providing anything that is relevant to them. And actually, I have a question for you, Ed, because what I've been thinking about a lot lately is the importance of AI in our sector. And what I find very interesting, I'm too old to really get fully into AI, or not yet at least. But in the last few weeks, I've been thinking about it more and more. And I do think that what might be very interesting to witness over the next whatever years and decades is how the humanitarian sector will change, because anything that is based on intelligence, like writing procedures or even designing solutions and all that, one day AI can do that, and AI can probably do that better than anyone of us can. So what remains is the human element, and it's the relationship, the empathy, the trust based, the stuff that we are trying to focus on. So I think it'd be interesting one day to have more of a conversation about the importance of that, and how AI how we can leverage it also, and help it, how we could use that also in our favor, because I do think this is what we are already trying to focus on. It's the stuff that AI cannot replace, and maybe that will automatically make some other people out of a job one day.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's even the stuff that money can't replace as well. I think that's what's interesting. I do agree with your observations about the situation in Congo and South Sudan on the one hand. I mean, I could challenge it by asking how maybe is there a danger of being complicit in the situation? If we've got to be very careful how you frame the appeal. If you're saying, if there's any hint that you're a global North organization trying to raise funds for vulnerable or marginalized people in another part of the world as an independent actor, we're not independent because we're all complicit in the global inequalities. And I'm halfway through writing this book this led me to dive quite deep into really how the situation in the Great Lakes region of Africa, how it, going back to the 1890s and even before, all the different ways that the rest of the world has been involved in perpetuating that conflict right up until today, and actually how explicit strategies from the global North, including from the governments over the last few years from the UK, have played quite a significant role in the perpetuation of that situation. I think you always have to believe the caveat that they're not uniquely responsible for the violence. As individuals, of course, everyone's involved, but at the same time, you can very clearly point to the global inequalities and global injustices and you form quite easy logical flows that demonstrate the links. There's a lot of factors involved, but a lot of it always just comes back to the injustices in the world that perpetuate that situation that we're all a part of. And I think around your questions connected with AI, I think what hopefully will happen, I mean, the danger is that AI could make the humanitarian sector even more systemized and compartmentalized. So it's like, this person's suffering. If we do X, then they will suffer less. Which I think has been increasingly common. And a lot of the people that are really into AI are also into these movements like effective altruism, which is let's just turn humanitarianism into a maths equation, and we work out how many lives can be best saved with $1. There's a danger, because ultimately a lot of the things you're talking about feed into that, because why else because I was going to ask you earlier, what do the RLOs come to you for guidance on? If it's to do with how do we best fit into the sector, it can often mean how do we get better at monitoring evaluation and writing reports and fulfilling our due diligence and compliance requirements, and all of those things that really are just about that formula of how this supposed aid sector can save as many lives as possible, and how they can become a partner on that chain. I mean, save lives, you can swap in other phrases like lift people out of poverty or whatever it is. So what I fear about AI is how does it just encourage humanitarian actors just to become more systemized, which by definition, in my opinion, would mean becoming more exclusionary. And actually, how do we, like you say, elevate the human? Maybe what it'll do is it'll just strip everything. It will shine the light on how, in the end, we've got to strip everything away to trust-based human relationships, as basically the only conduit of humanitarianism, which is, to me, it's a message of hope because it means anyone can be involved. It also removes the identity element because, by definition, trust-based is agnostic of identity. It's certainly is agnostic of superficial levels of identity. But what it does call is for us to all keep learning what it can look like, what it can mean to build more appropriate relationships. No one has the answer to that. It's an ongoing question that we'll have to continue exploring over the generations to come.
Yeah, very philosophical and interesting things to think about. But I think also just quickly to come back to your question about emergencies, I do think, and I wasn't sure which case you were referring to, but I do think there would be a difference between whether you're talking about engaging in an emergency context that developed or happened in a place where you already had a presence or you already had relationships with RLOs, because I think then I would say, yes, you absolutely do consider continuing to support them, also because if that's your brothers and sisters there, you don't let them starve, you don't let them die of limited access to healthcare and stuff like this. But if you're talking about engaging in a new context where you not yet have connections, I think it's more challenging, because then of course everything that you said applies, and all of that makes it also harder for you to make decisions. And so I think that's a significant difference, whether you already have the relationships there and therefore engage, or not even engage, because it wouldn't be a new involvement. It would just be a different nature of your relationship for the time being. But I think that to me would make the big difference.
Yeah, well, that brings me back to something you said really early on about what the structure of Same Skies and what you are as a group of people, because we're also all very much what's the word? We're kind of programmed into seeing organizations in institutional sense, or even a corporatized sense, whereas actually that can itself create limitations. And if instead you're a group of people with similar values, then and again, if there's no money involved, this is so much easier to do because you don't have some people on the payroll and some people not. You say if Same Skies is a concept of values and anyone can kind of be part of it, then that can create opportunities to widen the net of people involved. But I think it also creates a challenge based on the question you just asked, because this is what we're trying to do. And the way we're doing it in practice at the moment, in the 10 countries where we have a presence as Cohere, it's only in Kenya and Uganda that we have full-time staff living and working full-time in refugee hosting areas. In all the other contexts, we have location-based consultants who are compensated for the time they give to Cohere, but they're busy with their other full-time jobs. And they join our meetings at least once a week and share their experiences and help us to build relationships in those places. So the answer to your question is tough, because we don't, in some ways we're not present there, but in other ways we are, because our web of relationships is extended. But what we're finding is that they're much more fragile, those networks of relationships, than in Kenya and Uganda, where we're spending a lot of time. We're spending nearly all the time and visiting our partners many times a week in some cases. And not just that we have multiple colleagues doing that and able to swap notes and talk about it. Whereas in Congo, for example, we only have one location-based consultant, and it's a huge country. So the relationships are increasingly remote. So the trust we're able to build as Cohere would take a lot more investment. So we can't really channel the support in the same way that we would in Kenya and Uganda anyway. If there was an emergency that we would need to fundraise for in Uganda, it would be easier for us to feel confident that the funds we disperse would support and wouldn't challenge our trust-based relationships in the way that in Congo it's not as easy to do. But yeah, that was one of my questions I was going to ask about Same Skies and how you could envisage a future where where perhaps, like, you never know how long funding is going to be available. How could it look in that type of a situation? And are there ways in which you could also reduce the limitations of what people think of as being an organization or being an institution? That could be my last question.
Yeah, I think, that we are already much smaller than Cohere, for example. Like, we are 4 paid staff only, and the rest of us are already more of a network of pro bono consultants that bring different expertise, which we tap into whenever we need it. So let's say if we have a specific request, to give you an example, we had a request from one of the RLOs to have more specific training on how to be more inclusive, how to cater to the needs of children with special needs, etc. So for that, we don't have a full-time staff member employed who would have that expertise, but we do have within our network of people that are involved on a pro bono basis, people who have that experience. And so then we can approach them, we can ask them to offer that kind of support, and they usually do that pro bono. We don't pay them for it. So in that sense, I think, that's also in people's heads, what does that organization mean? What does it mean? Because we are registered in 4 countries, people often assume that we are a huge organization with so many staff members, which we are not. We don't have more than 4 paid staff. We don't have an actual headquarters or an office even. So I think we already operate in a pretty fluid, dynamic kind of way. And, what you're going back to is the question you asked me another time, right? Whether we could, when you proposed that idea or you presented that idea to me that you have those country consultants, we don't even have them. Like, we don't even have a presence in all those countries. When I say presence, I actually mean mostly, do you already have RLO partners there?
Yeah.
Because we do not have a presence, we do not have staff in any of those countries anyway. So that is not in our approach or in the way we work. It's not a requirement that we have staff in the country where we have RLO partners. That's not the case already.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've always learned a lot from you and from these conversations. So thanks for engaging in all these topics again for over an hour. And I think we could, as Cohere, continue to learning a lot from your experiences in Indonesia and Malaysia and in running Same Skies. We could definitely talk again, I know. So we could leave it there for now. And thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much, Ed. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and you always challenge my thoughts, so that's very much appreciated, and I learned just as much from you, so thank you for inviting me.
Same. Thanks.